Frenchman René Descartes was best known for the most famous quote in philosophy, "I think, therefore I am." That quote, and his most famous book, Meditations, have inspired the picture of Descartes as a dreamy thinker detached from the world. And many poor philosophy teachers and textbooks say, yes, Descartes, the philosopher of doubt. He had a method of doubt. And this view is understandable, but it's very far from true. The willingness to doubt ideas which we take for granted is in Descartes' method, but doubting is only a tool in service of his higher goal. Descartes claimed to have discovered a philosophical method that he did not learn in his schooling, that was not taught in schooling, but a method that could guide reason. His method was a method of science, of belief, not of doubt. From my childhood I have been nourished upon letters, and because I was persuaded that by their means one could acquire a clear and certain knowledge of all that is useful in life, I was extremely eager to learn them. But as soon as I had completed the course of study, at the end of which one is normally admitted to the ranks of the learned, I completely changed my opinion. For I found myself beset by so many doubts and errors that I came to think that I had gained nothing from my attempts to become educated, but increasing recognition of my ignorance. Now, two things about this. One is that he saw how dry and meaningless his education was, and sadly, throughout the entire history of education, there's been a lot of dry and meaningless education that has gone on. Rote repetition of what the teacher said is really not that helpful, and Descartes figured that out. But the second thing that he's saying here is that when you do get to a point where you have some knowledge, if you really have some knowledge, it is that I don't really know that much. This harkens back to Socrates, and one of Plato's dialogue is that if I am smarter than other men, it is only because I am more aware of how little I know. And of course, that's one of the key things that you look at people and realize they're kind of stupid, is when they think they know things they don't really know. So Descartes rejects not learning, but the formal education of his time, because what he feels he has come to understand now is that he needs to go out and undertake studies himself, because the ultimate judge of what is true or not has to be shown and proven through life, and not just simply experience in the sense of my eyes tell me this, my ears tell me this. No, life itself, and using the mind to understand what we experience in life. So Descartes resolved to go out into the world and learn from the book of the world. And there's a strong bit of Aristotle in that, because, of course, that's what Aristotle says. We learn by observing the world. But what Descartes also understood is that it's not simply what we see, because our senses can deceive us. And that's what Plato had to say. And it's not like Aristotle completely disregarded that notion. But by the time of Descartes, the Aristotelians, who completely dominated all intellectual activity in Descartes' time, the idea of not believing what you see was kind of lost, because if you see it in the books, it must be true. And this notion of what I think is best called authoritarianism, not in a political sense, but just in a knowledge sense, authoritarianism idea that what you are told, what you are taught, is what must be true, because otherwise it wouldn't be taught to you. The authorities wouldn't believe this if it was wrong, right? Your teachers would never lie to you. I mean, I, of course, would never lie to you, but we don't know for sure about anybody else. Of course, that's wrong. You can't believe differently. And I mentioned before about heresy. Heresy from the word meaning to hold an opinion, to hold a position. You can't have an opinion. You can't hold a position. You have to believe in what the books say. Descartes did not have a method of doubt so much as he had a method of avoiding error. He is looking for knowledge upon which we can base all certainty, that we can know for sure is true. And the way to do that, he says, is to be able to come one step at a time toward truth. We don't just come to it on our own. Now, he does employ doubt, but a methodology that uses doubt is not necessarily a method of doubt. It is a method of avoiding error to reach certainty. Descartes discusses his method in two books that he wrote before he wrote the more famous Meditations, which we'll get to later, The Evil Demon and all that fun stuff. He wrote Rules for the Direction of the Mind and Discourse on Method. And they're two books that basically talk about the same idea, his method of coming to understand truth. And so he writes as follows. Like one walking alone in the dark, I resolved to proceed so slowly and with such circumspection that if I did not advance far, I would at least guard against falling. Among the branches of philosophy, I had in an earlier period given some attention to logic, and among those of the mathematics to geometrical analysis and algebra, 3 arts or sciences which I ought, as I conceived, to contribute something to my design. But on examination I found that as for logic, its syllogisms and the majority of its other precepts are of avail only in the communication of what we already know, and not in speaking without judgment of things in which we are ignorant, or in the investigation of the unknown. And although this science contains indeed a number of correct and very excellent precepts, there are, nevertheless, so many others, and these either injurious or superfluous, mingled with the former, that it is almost quite as difficult to effect a severance of the true from the false, as it is to extract a Diana or a Minerva from the rough block of marble. Then, as to the analysis of the ancients and the algebra of the moderns, besides that they embrace only matters highly abstract and to appearance of no use, the former is so exclusively restricted to the considerations of figures, that it can exercise the understanding only on condition of greatly fatiguing the imagination, and in the latter there is so complete a subjection to certain rules and formulas, that there results an art full of confusion and obscurity, calculated to embarrass, instead of a science fitted to cultivate the mind. So, pause here for a second, because look at what Descartes is doing here. He is saying that these things that we've been given us, these 3 arts or sciences of logic, geometrical analysis, and algebra, they really don't help us. And they're so full of rules that all they serve to really do is embarrass us. However, he says, it is the case that they do have some value. They're not worthless. He's not completely throwing them out. But he is saying that they are insufficient in and of themselves to tell us about the world. Remember William. Always remember William. Logic tells us nothing about the world, about how things are. Descartes understands that. So how, he says, can we seek some other method which could comprise the advantages of the 3, logic, geometrical analysis, and algebra, but be exempt from their defects? Instead of the great number of precepts of which logic is composed, I believe that the 4 following rules would prove perfectly sufficient for me. These are, then, his 4 rules for the direction of the mind. The first was never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid precipitancy and prejudice, and to compromise nothing more in my judgment than what was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt. Now let's linger on this. Let's think about this for a second. This first law, never to accept anything for true that I did not clearly know to be such. Now that sounds pretty basic. Yeah, I don't believe something that I don't know is true. Realize the magnitude of what he is saying here. Never accept anything for true that I do not clearly know to be such. And that hyperbole is very deeply meant by Descartes. Never accept anything that is not beyond all doubt. It must be presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt. So he's removing doubt. Remember, it's not a method of doubt, it's a method of avoiding error by removing doubt. Keep that in mind and move to the second rule. Divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible and as might be necessary for its adequate solution. This is actually a very good strategy for solving any problem in life. Break the problem down into as many parts as are necessary to help you solve it. When we have an enormous project, what we really need to do first and foremost is break it down into manageable chunks. First you need to do the research, then you need to think an outline of what you're going to say in response to the research that you've done. Then you need to kind of fill in this chapter and then work on that. Do what you need to do. Break it into parts. The third rule, then, is to conduct my thoughts in such order that by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend by little and little, and as it were step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex, assigning in thought a certain order even to those objects which in their own nature do not stand in a relation of antecedence and sequence. Okay, very complicated there, but quite simply, what he's saying in all of that is begin at the beginning, which often is the simplest bit, and armed with that, move through these difficulties step by step, little by little, from the simple to the more complex. It's the old adage of pick the low-hanging fruit first. Solve the simple problems first, and armed with the solutions of those simple problems, we can then move on to the more complex problems. And we can figure out which problems are more simple and more complex because we have taken the time in step 2, rule 2 here, to divide all those difficulties into parts. And then we can identify, okay, so if we solve this problem first, that's simple, and then that'll help us solve the other more complex parts of our problem. And so the last or fourth rule, in every case, to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted. Now, this is just good practice, right? Don't accept anything that isn't truly done. Don't stop unless you are thoroughly finished. Enumeration so complete and reviews so general. One of the chief things I see from students all the time is they rush to conclusions because they haven't really looked at it thoroughly. Enumerations so complete. They've not really done the research, not really done the thinking, and not made reviews so general. They haven't thought outside of that what's right in front of them. Oh, well, what I see, it must be real. No, maybe there's something more going on. And that's what we need to avoid. And in each one of these rules, what we can see in Descartes is his prime principle of avoiding precipitancy. We avoid error by avoiding precipitancy. Now, what do I mean by precipitancy? That's not a word we use much. Today, we use the phrase jumping to conclusions, which I probably already used here. We don't jump to conclusions. We don't come to I know what's going on before we really know what's going on. Precipitancy is to prejudge, is accepting something as true without due critical inquiry. Don't be fooled by words. Don't be fooled by authorities. Don't be fooled by your senses. Don't make prejudgments. We too easily accept quick judgments, or just the words themselves, as though that's knowledge. Descartes is telling us we need to see things for yourself, the actual way your mind works, the world works, reason about it, come to a real truth of things. So look at his 4 rules now, keeping in mind that the issue is avoiding precipitancy. First rule, never accept anything for true that I could not clearly know to be such. Avoid precipitancy. Second, divide each of the difficulties into as many parts as possible as necessary. Avoid precipitancy. Don't just say, I'm going to take on the whole thing. No, divide it into parts. Don't jump the gun. Third rule, conduct my thoughts in order, commencing from the simplest to the most complex. Again, avoid precipitancy. Move methodically through the process of solving the problem. And last, make numeration so complete and review so general that we don't leave anything behind, that we don't miss the truth that's there. Avoid precipitancy. Don't jump to conclusion. Don't rush to judgment. And so for Descartes, he is going through 2 tracks here. One is turning inward to try to understand what is going on within his own mind, and by extension all human minds. And 2, looking outward toward what does the world have to tell us? And if we can sync up the internal mind and the external world, then we can come to truth. So there is both a look to mental rational processes and a look to sensory experience of the world. Only when they are united and put in its proper order will we come to truth. And this is where he comes to his method of science, or what he calls in the book that he wrote, Rules for the Direction of the Mind. We have a powerful mind. How do we use it? And how do we use it in such a way that we are avoiding error? On the inward track of looking at our own mental processes, Descartes places tremendous belief and faith into the power of the human mind. He believes perhaps even more in rationality itself and the human mind's ability to use rationality over everything else that he could possibly believe in. See, he looks at mathematics and he says, mathematics is absolute truth. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It always equals 4. It cannot equal anything else but 4. And this is true at any time in time. It's true at any place in the world. 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can change the names of the language, but the underlying principle of mathematics remains absolute truth. Descartes claims that if we reason carefully, it is, and I quote him here, quite impossible for me to go wrong. Impossible, impossible, inconceivable that my reasoning could ever be wrong if, and here's the huge if I'm reasoning carefully, because there is the world out there, of which we have to take in knowledge and experience from the world to have things to think about. Now, we do make mistakes. So what then is the source of my mistakes, he asks? Because if reason is perfect, because mathematics is perfect, logic is perfect, it doesn't tell us about the world, but we know it's perfect in and of itself, so how do I take that level of certainty into the world itself? And why is it that we make mistakes in reasoning incorrectly if reason itself is perfect? It's impossible for me to make a mistake if I'm reasoning carefully, because reason is perfect. So how can I reason about the imperfect world and our imperfect senses such that I can come to truth? Well, he says, the source of my mistake must simply be in this. The scope of the will is wider than that of the intellect. Think about that for a second. The scope of the will is wider than that of the intellect. Now, will is a very difficult concept in philosophy and in life in general, but this idea that we can want things, we can choose things, one thing that I will die on this hill. We have free will. Every single individual human being has free will. We can make choices. We choose what we think, what we believe, what we do. We are influenced by the world. Sometimes we give away our free will to forces in the world. But as the song says, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You are always making a choice. If you're believing me or not believing me right now, you're making a choice. If you don't believe that there is free will, you are making a free will choice to not believe in free will. Okay, end of diatribe. But that's very important. Very, 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 very important for the whole rest of everything in your life and philosophy in this course. You have free will. We all have free will. And Descartes says correctly that the capability of our free will and the scope of our free will is wider than that of the intellect. And you don't have to go to school to figure that one out. You figured that out at an early age. Why? Because you can see yourself and you can see other people doing dumb stuff. People do dumb stuff all the time. They make mistakes. Why do they make mistakes? Why do people do dumb stuff? In a way, that's kind of one of Descartes' big questions. How can we find certainty? And why do people do dumb stuff? Why do people believe dumb stuff when the evidence is clearly to the contrary? There's a major issue for our time today. Why do people believe dumb stuff instead of the evidence showing them that they're wrong? Well, it's because, Descartes says, the scope of the will is wider than that of the intellect. So Descartes says, because the will, when it's not restricted within limits, it extends itself to matters that I do not understand. And since the will is indifferent in such cases, it easily turns aside from what is true and good, and this is the source of my error and sin. Sin not in a religious sense at all, but just sin in, wow, you really did something wrong in believing that dumb stuff. So what Descartes is saying here is that your will wants to believe certain things, wants to do certain things, see certain things, hear certain things, and feel certain things. And because it has this capacity to go beyond the intellect, it does. And it starts to believe things that aren't true, that there's no evidence behind it. That's the source of our error. That's the source of all of our errors, Descartes says. When we allow the will to precede the intellect and not be restrained by the intellect, we make mistakes. It's not a mistake of reasoning, it's a mistake of not reasoning. Now, this is a point on which both Plato and Aristotle and quite a few other philosophers between them and Descartes would heartily agree with. Yeah, when our will goes farther and faster than our intellect can restrain it, we start believing dumb stuff and we start making dumb mistakes. For Descartes, one of the chief ways that we make these mistakes is in the matter of believing our senses without thinking thoroughly about what our senses are telling us. We can be fooled by our experiences. There's no question about that. We do need sense experiences. He absolutely never denies the value of observational sciences. But what he's saying is that though we want to learn about the physical world and need to learn about the physical world, we can't be completely passive in our perception. Instead of just simply taking in all of our sense impressions and believing exactly what we see and exactly what we hear, we need to have an active mind to make judgments on those perceptions. Because the material physical objects of the world are not always exactly the way they appear to the senses. We can be deceived. And that's the point of his meditation about the evil demon. An evil demon could be tricking me. I feel like I'm sitting here. I feel like I'm seeing these things and hearing these things. I even feel like I am having these thoughts. But I could be deceived because I know I can be deceived. And you know you can be deceived because, I'm sorry, you're not perfect.
Hopefully you've had more true experiences and judgments than false ones. But you should always remember you can make false judgments, because seeing is not believing. So I could be being fooled. Descartes' evil demon thought experiment is simply, it's possible, in the realm of imagination possibility, that everything that I have ever perceived is an illusion forced upon me by some sort of evil supernatural being, or just something outside of my understanding and experience. There was a certain trilogy of movies that took on this idea, did it, in my opinion, very poorly. It made all kinds of philosophical mistakes, but yes, I'm talking about The Matrix. That idea of, everything we perceive could be wrong. We could be deliberately being deceived by forces outside of our control. And The Matrix actually wasn't even the first to really pick up on this. There was a philosopher in the 20th century that talked about, well, how do we know we're not just a brain in a vat sitting in the lab of some mad scientist? Science fiction is really good at exploring some of these philosophical issues. So Descartes says, okay, maybe we are, if, turn it into 21st century parlance, we're trapped in the matrix, or we're a brain in the vat, to use the 20th century analogy, and everything that we think we perceive is wrong. The point of the evil demon thought experiment is that even if we could doubt every single thing that we've ever thought, what remains that cannot be denied is that I am thinking. And the cogito ergo sum is usually translated as I think, therefore I am. But that's only one part of what Descartes is really saying here. He does say that the demon could deceive me about anything and everything, but can it deceive me from thinking that I exist when in fact I don't exist? And obviously and he takes this argument from Augustine, the Christian philosopher from centuries earlier, that no matter what, if I can ask myself the question, am I being deceived? The very fact that I can ask that question proves I must exist. Because, of course, as Augustine said, if I'm not existing, I couldn't be thinking about the question. So Descartes, kind of plagiarizing Augustine here, says, doubtless then, no matter what the deepest cunning of the demon is, doubtless then I exist, since I am deceived, and let him deceive me as he may, he can never bring it about that I am nothing. So long as I shall be conscious that I am something, it must be maintained, all things being maturely and carefully considered, that this proposition, I am, I exist, is necessarily true each time it is expressed by me or conceived in my mind. And the point of this isn't to just say, haha, I exist, you can't prove me wrong. It is to say that our thinking is the foundation of everything. He goes on to say, thinking is another attribute of the soul. And here I discover what properly belongs to myself. This alone is inseparable from me. I am, I exist, that is certain, but how often? As often as I think. For perhaps it would even happen if I should wholly cease to think, that I should at the same time altogether cease to be. And now here's the really important bit for his method. I am therefore, precisely speaking, only a thinking thing. That is a mind, understanding, or reason. I am a real thing, really existent. But what thing? The answer is a thinking thing. I am a thinking thing. But what is a thinking thing? It is a thing that doubts, understands, conceives, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, imagines, and perceives. What we are is a thinking being. We cannot have any other possibility on which to base our understanding of the world around us and our understanding of ourselves aside from the foundation that we are this thinking being who can rationalize, who can understand, who can will, and can make choices. So I can doubt my senses and should doubt my senses. I can doubt whether the external world exists, but I have to accept that it exists, because I have to accept that I exist, I have perceptions, and that if I can think clearly, because I am a thinking, reasoning being, that if I reason carefully, I can come to understand my sense impressions and come to understand the world. So understanding this, we can really fully understand Descartes' method. The method of rules for the direction of the mind is literally the highest truth about ourselves, the highest truthful method of how we should conduct ourselves as a thinking being, one who avoids precipitancy by restraining the will and always making sure that reason is ruling our perceptions and will and imagination. It's not a method of doubt, it's a method of avoiding error. Methodically avoiding error by reasoning clearly, and that is being true to the type of being that we are.
So how do we employ this method? How do we make it work in observing the real world? And Descartes gives us a brilliant example, in my opinion, one of the best thought experiments in all the history of philosophy. I know it simply as the wax example. And it's really underplayed because all the textbooks out there, they want to talk about, Descartes the evil demon, and Descartes and his doubt, and Descartes the dreamy philosopher. No. Descartes' wax example really shows what his method is all about. And it's in his book Meditations. It's a way of seeing how we can get past mere appearances into what's really going on. But really what Descartes is doing here is he's trying to show that it's not sense observation that is the ultimate judge of what we know to be true. It is, in fact, our minds and our ability to reason about things. That's the ultimate judge for us. And so the wax example is about observation and thinking about observation to come to truth. And it's called wax because he uses a honeycomb. Now, in our day and age, we've probably never seen a honeycomb. I have to go back to my youth when I lived in rural Minnesota. We used to buy honey in a honeycomb, and I suppose most people have never seen one. It's kind of coming back now because we're into this organic, small-scale farming sort of thing. But a honeycomb is, of course, what bees use to gestate their young and, of course, store honey, which is food for them. And, okay, so a honeycomb is a hexagonal shape, and here's my poor drawing skills on evidence here. But it's a grid of hexagons, which engineers now tell us is probably the best way to build anything of great strength, but bees are smarter than us. And so Descartes says, I take this honeycomb, and I observe the properties that this honeycomb exhibits to me. So these are the properties of the honeycomb. And what happens, he says, if I set the honeycomb by the fire? Remember, in Meditations, he's sitting by his fire in his dressing gown, and he's contemplating life, the universe, and everything. And he decides, I don't know, he needs to go make a cup of tea. And he's got honey for his teeth. That's a really good idea. But he sets the honeycomb down next to the fire where he's sitting. And he goes off, and he makes some tea. And he comes back a little bit later, and he's got his tea now, and he's going to put the honey in his tea, and the honeycomb is gone. It's now, as he kind of says, a puddle of goo. This is goo. Of course, when you when you see this situation, it's like you left the room, you came back, there's no honeycomb, there's just goo. What's your first thought, right? Well, your first thought is someone came into my room, stole my honeycomb, and left me with a puddle of goo instead. Or, aliens. Aliens came down, whisked away my honeycomb, and beamed down, Star Trek reference, this puddle of goo instead. Or maybe some sort of heat ray, new weapon by those evil English Protestants, and they zapped my honeycomb with a secret weapon and turned it into goo. Or just, no, we don't think of all these things, do we? We don't come up with these fantastical stories because we're not conspiracy theorists. What do we immediately assume when we walk back into the room and see where our honeycomb was? There's this puddle of goo. We said, oh my God, something changed this into that. That's what we think immediately. Change. So Descartes is asking us, why do we think that? And we will think that even though we have never seen a honeycomb melt into a puddle of goo. We can do that because we have a mind. And our mind is capable of filling in the gaps. Our reason tells us what's going on. Now, obviously, yes, you can do experiments. You can melt honeycombs. We can place honeycombs in front of a fire, on a stove, in a pan, and we can watch them melt, and we can compare that to the goo that we have here and prove empirically that this must be the case. Although, as we will see when we get to David Hume, it's not that simple, as much as we'd like to believe. But for our purposes now, yes, we can do that. But here's the thing. We can do that type of science only because before we start doing that type of science, our minds can go through this method and our minds can come up with the understanding of what's going on. Because when we see this, well, if we were nothing but a perceiver, we would just go, oh, now I have goo. I don't have honeycomb. I have goo. What do I do with the goo? No, we're rational creatures, and because we're rational creatures, we can say, okay, this changed into that, and then we can ask ourselves why, how can I reproduce this if it's a good outcome? How can I not make it happen again if it's a bad outcome? That's what the rationality parts of ourselves allow us to do. We can think beyond mere appearances into what is really going on. And if we have nothing but appearances, then we cannot really come to truth and understanding about our world. We really can't.